Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin with a historical overview as an introduction to the slide that you see behind me. These are the theories regarding the theories that we had for many years. When I was younger, we used to quote and we learned the words of Fukuyama about the pace of the large wars. And later on, even in the Golani Brigade, we read the story about Lexus and the olive tree. And I remember the quote, Thomas Friedman half asks and half responds, did you know that a war never broke out between two countries that had branches of McDonald's and in Israel as well, theories developed over the years that were based on two assumptions. That first, we don't have territorial goals anymore, and second, if any of our enemies continues to be bad, then we'll strike them with force, and there are very familiar quotes related to this issue. Churchill, I often quote something that Churchill said. He said that strategy, no matter how aesthetic it is, you have to look at its outcomes sometimes, and the outcomes are right before our eyes. And in this context, I'd like to say that in general, two things. First, this is a war that is happening in Europe, not in the Balkans and not in the Middle East, and not in any other remote place, which indicates that the phenomenon of war has once again become part of the Western world. And again, this is an opportunity for us to study this conflict between armies that have Western capabilities, and this is a good opportunity to follow what's going on. But before we begin, I'd like to make two comments. One is related to the fact that we're still in the midst of the war, and there's a lot of disinformation. There are manipulations on the information that is available. We don't know everything, and we must remember that the war is still going on. And also, lessons are also dependent on context, and they can't necessarily be projected between time and place. And we have to take into account that there are cultural and political and social issues that are related, the sizes of the armies and their capabilities. So everything that I say, I want to say very cautiously, and that this is my own opinion, and the things I say now may seem less correct in the future. I would like to talk about two things that we are seeing and that might be related to our times as well. I don't want to talk about things that were probably talked about this morning and will be discussed later on in the day about the new global order and about the far-reached implications for the economy. I don't want to talk about the crises that we're experiencing, the crises related to gas, chips, wheat, etc. And I also don't want to talk about the arms race that many of us, our military industries and European countries are in the middle of now. I'd like to talk about two things. One is about expectations. If we had been asked at the beginning of February or the middle of February if there would be a war between Russia and Ukraine, the answers would have been divided about 80-20. People who believed that there would be war and people that were less believing. And even among those who believed there would be war, I don't think anyone imagined the type of war that we're seeing now. We all expected there to be some type of classic style of war, a rerun of the war in the Crimea Islands, the Crimean area, elegant and quick, something that used all the new dimensions that we hear about all the time. And my first message, the first lesson I learned from this situation is that we know how a war starts, but it can deteriorate to a war of attrition, like this picture I think demonstrates. And we don't know if it'll develop with the characteristics that we see today. It could also be something that we end up encountering with the enemies that we have who are developing capabilities and a ring of fire around us, making constant facing the possibility that they will attack our cities. I think that attempts must be made to end fighting as quickly as possible, and we have to excel at two things. One, in how we define how targets are defined, and second, the operative plan, so that there will be no questions about who the winner actually is. All the topics that you see on this screen, whether you can see them or not, these are issues that we deal with on a daily basis, and the IDF is constantly learning about them, from what is happening in Ukraine. If I would divide this slide into subsections, I think that the material is available, so I won't go into detail because it is discussed every so often. But I think that many of these issues are, for example, maneuvering and logistic failures and differential capabilities of the forces and other things related to the ground fire. These are all related, in my opinion, to three main themes. One is the failure of the Russians' assumptions at the beginning of the battle. The second is related to tactic failures. Ultimately, we're seeing behaviors or ways in which the plans were carried out. There are professional failures that we're seeing. I don't think that we should get into detail. This is the place to discuss them in detail. And the third is the misconceptions about the new dimensions that the efforts, I'm talking about aspects of cyber and COVID and spectrum and things like that, that we attributed significant importance to at the beginning of the fighting, at the beginning of the war, and based on what we saw from our recent history. And these were proven as less relevant once the scale of fighting is as large as it is here. So the lesson that we may learn from this is that once you decide to wage war, you should come as prepared as possible, and most importantly, you have to be alert and critical about the way you define your presumptions and about the strategic assumptions you make. And I'm not sure I'm telling you anything new, but these definitely collapsed one after another. From here, I would like to go on to talking about the more general lessons that I think we can learn from about what's happening and that are related to more extensive phenomenon. I'll talk about 5 issues: fire, the new aerial level, and the impact of both of those on how the war is being waged. And the 2 last issues are related to one another. One is fighting in urban areas, and the second is civilians during war. So just a word about this slide, the missile supremacy over the platform. You're all familiar with the quotes from the Yom Kippur War. I think that some things have changed nonetheless. I think that the distance, the diversity, the penetrability, the line of view, and especially the precision make the missile threat much greater than it was in the past. And it's on a much larger scale, and its impact on our freedom of movement in the sea, in the air, and on land is significantly impacted. It's very different than it was before. I think that when you have capabilities of this kind, and when you add what I said before, you add the mistaken assumptions at the basis of the plan and tactical failures on the other hand, and Western capabilities on the other hand, then the outcome are things that we're seeing now. Another dimension has to be considered is the new aerial dimension. If you're following the developments in this field, it is nothing new that there are capabilities in this area, and we've seen how a high-quality drone unit can cause significant damage against the Armenian the Armenian army, even without any manned aircraft going into the air. And none of these most of these products are produced by civilian industries from the East. They don't have the type of regulation that we have here, but they do enable two things. One is the ability, vertical attack capabilities, and you can see that from the videos and the pictures that are posted each and every day. And something more interesting that they can do is converting imprecise weapons to precise missiles. And if you follow what's going on there, you can see how when a drone is in the air and immediately afterwards an anti-tank missile is shot, followed by artillery from Ukraine. And the tendency to assume that most of the damage is caused by the anti-tank missiles, but the artillery that the drone makes precise is no less damaging and harmful than the more powerful weapons. The fire and the new aerial dimension reduce the room to maneuver. They narrow the battlefield and they give the defense more advantages over the offensive army. From where I stand, these trends were very clear to us, and to a great extent we're preparing for these scenarios. This war has only emphasized our understanding of these developments. I think that in general, in the IDF, we're trying to do two things. One is to use the same dimensions in order to enable us to give us a better picture of the battlefield and to trace the enemy faster, to disrupt the enemy's efforts, and to shoot precisely and at the right time. This is based on two principles. One, defending the forces, and I think we're in a different place than what we see here, especially in the Russian armored forces. And second is the lethal dimension, so that the forces do not need only the external envelope that we can provide with all of our amazing capabilities. The next aspect is fighting within urban areas. We're 84 days into the war, and I think about 80 of those days, the Russian army has been fighting in Mariupol to a certain degree. I'm not talking about Kiev at this stage, but we're talking about a city with 450,000 people. There are cities of this size in Israel as well. And as of now, Russia hasn't obtained operational control over the city. And if we talk about Kiev, they turned around and withdrew and retreated from there. And I think that conquering large cities of this kind is an enormous challenge, even for a strong and large army like Russia, and especially for smaller armies. But on the other hand, looking at our area, it seems that we won't have any way of achieving our goals without passing through different villages or different cities. the capabilities that I talked about before that take advantage of the aerial dimension and enable use of all the different dimensions to trace the enemy and destroy the enemy at relevant time. I think it also has the ability to enable us, to give us the choice, to give us the option of not going through all the cities along the way. And even when we do have to pass through cities, the ability to hold back the enemy and destroy the enemy to a great extent is something that will allow, this is something that we're preparing for and will enable us to take moderate and smart action and use the ground forces wisely. And apparently there will also obviously be a need for face-to-face battles. In urban warfare, and this is something that should be discussed within the IDF as well, is what is the expected outcome? And we saw during the war that sometimes the expected outcomes changed based on reality, based on the reality that the Russians encountered there. And the last thing that I want to say is a word about civilians during war. And this is something that I think is troubling because, as I said before, we don't have a choice. If you know what the Gaza Strip looks like, you know what Lebanon looks like, or even Judea and Samaria, there aren't any areas that aren't urban. And here you can see several issues. One, the fact that you took civilians with minimal training or no training at all, you gave them weapons, and then suddenly you have many more soldiers. In many cases, civilians become live shields to stop the Russian armored forces from advancing. And if I would go 2 slides back, every civilian today is an observation station. Every civilian is a broadcasting station. Every civilian is an observer for the Ukrainian artillery. And the preparations within the neighborhoods, within the buildings, and the way the forces are supplied is part of the war effort. And what's possibly even more important than anything I've said until now in the civilian context, and I think I heard Ron say something about this outside, for the Ukrainians, this war is defining a new national identity, while for the Russians, it is having the opposite effect. And I will conclude with this slide that takes me back to my first slide. Over the past decade, there has been more and more professional literature, conferences, and articles, publications that focus on what's often called hybrid warfare. And the Western world are looking at what happened in the Crimean area and seeing how things are repeating itself. In many cases, the efforts were based on SIGINT and psychological warfare and some precision weapons, and also using actual fire in scattered cases. In the IDF as well, we have the visionary of this idea in this realm. In IDF, there's extensive activity in what is called the war between the wars, which is also influenced by these perspectives. And I think that this war, if there's anything that I take from it, and I think that we can all learn from it, is a reminder that's very critical, in my opinion, is the fact that even freedom to maneuver during war and during the war between the wars, what defines the outcome is the ability to use the military warfare as necessary. A reliable threat is dependent on actual ability, and when actual ability when the threat doesn't match the actual capabilities, then you might find yourself in the situation that Russia is in now. And the goal of any army, especially the IDF, is to win the war. And in our case, we can't be drawn into long wars, definitely not wars of attrition, while our home front is suffering a significant blow and significant damage. We have to present an operative ideas and practical implementations for transitioning the war to the other side and responding to fire that's aimed at us. All this has to be done within a reasonable amount of time and an acceptable number of casualties. That's the challenge that we face. There is a lot of material that we can learn from about things that we have to do here in Israel, but the test is still ahead of us and we have a long road ahead. Thank you very much.